Congratulations, Dan. You won the consolation prize. My brother Josh's laughter echoed through the lawyer's office like breaking glass. An old barn that's falling apart. Meanwhile, I get Dad's $4 million company. He clapped his hands theatrically, as if applauding a pathetic performance. The other family members in the room shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, some avoiding my gaze, others shaking their heads in silent disapproval. The lawyer, Mr. Morrison, cleared his throat awkwardly and tried to regain his professional composure. As I was saying, Daniel Campbell gets the 80-acre rural property in Asheville, including the main barn and the farmhouse. The farmhouse. Josh interrupted, doubled over with laughter. Man, that thing doesn't even have proper plumbing. I remember when we were kids, Dad always said he was going to fix it up one day. 20 years later, he was still waiting. My name is Dan, I'm 32 years old, and I just found out that my father considered my entire life to be worth exactly one dilapidated barn. As Josh continued his public humiliation show, I kept my expression neutral. Not because I accepted the situation, but because I learned early on that people reveal who they really are when they think you're defeated. And Josh was revealing much more than he realized. Sorry, little brother, he said, wiping away imaginary tears from laughing so hard. But let's be honest here. Dad always knew who had a knack for business and who was better at, how can I put it, working with their hands. He made air quotes when he said working with their hands, as if it were something shameful. As if the 15 years I spent as a civil engineer, designing bridges and hospitals, were some kind of insignificant hobby. The room fell silent for a moment. Until Josh, apparently unable to control his euphoria, added, "Hey, at least you can start a hay business. Or maybe a tourist attraction. Come see the barn where dreams go to die." That's when something inside me solidified. Not anger. Anger would have been too emotional. It was something colder, more calculated. A quiet certainty that Josh had made a fundamental mistake. He was celebrating victory before he knew all the rules of the game. As he laughed and the lawyer tried to continue with the paperwork, I remembered something my father had told me 3 months before he died. We were fixing the barn fence when he stopped, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Dan, sometimes the biggest surprises come wrapped in the simplest packages." At the time, I thought he was being philosophical about life in general. Now, watching Josh sign the company papers with that overconfidence, I began to suspect that Dad was being much more specific. If you're enjoying this story of family and unexpected inheritances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more stories of twists and turns that will surprise you. Because what Josh didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I had already been in the barn the week before. And what I found there would change everything we had just heard. Josh had always been like that. Ever since he was a child, he had this special ability to turn any situation into a performance where he was the star and everyone else was the audience. I remember when we were 10 and 13, respectively. Dad had promised to take us fishing at the lake behind the property. I had been excited for weeks, organizing my equipment, studying bait, preparing everything down to the smallest detail. On the agreed day, Josh decided that fishing was old people stuff, and convinced Dad to take him to the mall to buy a new video game. The result? I stayed home helping Mom in the garden while they came back 5 hours later with a Nintendo and pizza. Josh spent the rest of the afternoon showing me how I was wasting my time with outdated hobbies. That was the dynamic of our family. Josh asked, Josh got. Josh decided to change his mind at the last minute. Everyone adapted. And when someone questioned him, he always had a brilliant justification for why his needs were more important. The company Josh had just inherited wasn't just any business. Campbell Printing Solutions had been built with our father's sweat and blood over 40 years. It started in 1982 as a small print shop in downtown Asheville, operating out of a rented 20-square-meter room. Dad worked 16 hours a day in those early years. Mom always told how he would come home with his hands permanently stained with ink, so tired that he would sometimes fall asleep at the dinner table. But he never gave up. Every satisfied customer generated 2 referrals. Every job well done opened doors to bigger projects. When I was born in '91, the company had already moved into its own warehouse and employed 12 people. When Josh arrived 3 years later, Dad was printing material for hospitals, universities, and large corporations throughout the American Southeast. Josh grew up seeing only the final success. He never knew what it was like to wake up at 5 in the morning to check if the machines were working properly. He never spent late nights redoing jobs because a client changed their mind at the last minute. For Josh, Campbell Printing Solutions had always been synonymous with easy money and social prestige. And now, at 29, he had inherited everything without lifting a finger to build anything. Meanwhile, I got a barn. The same barn where Dad taught me about responsibility every summer of my childhood. Dan, he used to say, adjusting my safety helmet before letting me use the heavy tools. Building something that lasts isn't about having the best material. It's about understanding each piece and how they work together. Ironically, Josh never wanted to learn those lessons. Whenever Dad tried to get him involved in hands-on projects, he would make excuses. Football practice, hanging out with friends, homework that miraculously only appeared when tools were involved. Leaving the lawyer's office that afternoon, I felt the familiar weight of injustice. It was always like this. Josh would shine in the spotlight while I was left with the heavy lifting and no recognition. The difference was that this time, the injustice came with a $4 million inheritance. I drove to the barn in silence, trying to process what had happened. The property was 20 minutes from downtown Asheville, on a dirt road surrounded by mountains covered with oak and pine trees. The barn itself was imposing, a two-story wooden structure built in the 1950s, when the property was still a working cattle ranch. Dad had never sold the land after moving to the city. Someday, he always said, I'll come back here and build my dream house. I'll raise horses and have a workshop where I can work with wood in peace. That someday never came. After Mom died, he hardly ever visited the place. But I did. Over the years, especially during the most difficult times in my life, I would drive out there to think. The barn had become my refuge, my place to process problems and find solutions. That's exactly what I did that afternoon. I parked next to the structure and walked through the tall grass that needed to be cut. The barn's exterior walls showed signs of wear, peeling paint here and there, a few boards that needed to be replaced, but the structure was solid. Dad had built it to last for generations. I walked through the front door and breathed in the familiar smell of old hay and aged wood. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, creating geometric patterns on the concrete floor. It was exactly as I remembered it from my childhood. But something was different. The last time I had been there, 3 months ago for Dad's funeral, I had noticed that some things were out of place. Tools arranged differently. Some boxes moved. A small safe I had never seen before, discreetly positioned behind the workbench. At the time, I thought maybe Dad was using the space to store important company documents. Now, with the inheritance fresh in my mind and Josh's cruel words still echoing, I began to wonder if there was something more. I approached the safe. It was small, about the size of a shoebox, made of gray steel with a digital lock. Next to it, nailed to the wall, was a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's unmistakable handwriting. My heart raced. I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small golden key. Dan, the letter began, if you are reading this, then the lawyer has carried out my first instruction and Josh has shown his true colors during the reading of the will. I hope you weren't too hurt by his reaction, but I know Josh can't hide his true nature for long. I continued reading, my breathing quickening with each word. The barn isn't just an old building, my son. It's the place where I kept everything that really matters. Use the key to open the safe. Inside you will find instructions for accessing something that will change your perspective on this inheritance. Something Josh will never know exists. The letter ended with a line that made me smile for the first time since morning. Patience has always been your greatest virtue, Dan. Now the time has come to be rewarded for it. I inserted the golden key into the safe. The mechanism turned smoothly, and the door opened with a satisfying click. Inside were carefully organized documents, data CDs, and a second, much longer letter. But what caught my attention most was a small USB device with a handwritten label, for Dan, open only at home alone. As I organized everything into a backpack to take home, I couldn't stop thinking about the irony of the situation. Josh had spent the afternoon celebrating his victory, probably already planning how to spend his $4 million inheritance. And I had just discovered that Dad had a plan far more elaborate than any of us could have imagined. I arrived home at 9 o'clock that night, still processing the discovery in the barn. My apartment in downtown Asheville was small but organized, just as Dad had taught me to keep any workspace. Every tool in its place, every document filed correctly. I plugged the USB into my laptop and opened the only file present, a 47-minute video, recorded 3 months before Dad's death. The image showed him sitting in the same brown leather chair where he used to read the newspaper on Sundays. He looked thinner than I remembered, but his eyes still had that piercing clarity that intimidated me as a child. Dan, his voice came through the speakers clearly. If you're watching this, it means Josh reacted exactly as I expected during the reading of the will. He probably laughed in your face, didn't he? Called you a poor thing or something like that. Even through the screen, Dad could still read my thoughts with surgical precision. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone, not even your mother. Campbell Printing Solutions isn't worth $4 million. It's worth $600,000, maybe $700,000 on a good day. The rest is debt, overvalued contracts, and financed equipment that Josh will discover in the coming weeks. My stomach dropped. Josh hadn't inherited an empire. He inherited a carefully disguised financial nightmare. Dad went on to explain how he had manipulated the numbers over the past 2 years, creating an illusion of prosperity that would fool any superficial analysis. 3-year contracts that looked profitable on paper but would be impossible to fulfill with the promised margin. Loans against equipment that lost value faster than expected. Josh always believed that success in business was about charisma and connections, Dad said, his eyes fixed on the camera. He never learned to read a real balance sheet. He never questioned the numbers I presented at family meetings. For him, math was boring stuff that other people did. The second part of the video revealed something even more shocking. Dad had been secretly transferring the company's real assets to a holding company in my name for the past 5 years. Not the money, that would leave obvious traces. But the intellectual property, the patents for printing processes he had developed, the exclusive contracts with European suppliers, and most importantly, the complete list of real customers with payment histories. The company Josh inherited is an empty shell with a nice brand name, Dad explained. The real company, the one that's worth anything, is registered under Campbell Holdings, LLC. And you're the sole owner. I paused the video and walked over to the window. Down below, Asheville continued its normal nighttime routine. Cars passing by, people returning from restaurants, teenagers laughing too loudly on the sidewalks. A world completely oblivious to the fact that my entire life had changed in 2 hours. I returned to the laptop. The video still had 20 minutes left. Now Dan, you have a choice, Dad said, his expression turning more serious. You can use this information to help your brother when he finds out the truth, and he will find out very soon. Or you can let him learn the lessons I never managed to teach him. He paused for a long moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. Josh always believed I favored him because I gave him more money, more opportunities, more attention. The truth is, I was trying to teach humility to a person who refused to learn. Every privilege I gave him was a test he failed. Every responsibility I offered him was ignored because it wasn't glamorous enough. The phone rang, interrupting the video. Josh. Hey little bro. His voice was even more excited than it had been that morning. Guess what? I just left my first corporate dinner as CEO of Campbell. 23 important people from Asheville wanting to do business with me. Including the mayor. That's great, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Man, you should have seen it. $200 a bottle champagne, fresh oysters, the whole fucking shebang. And everyone treating me like the new king of the city. He laughed loudly. Meanwhile, you're there in your little apartment watching Netflix, right? Something like that. Look, I know today was hard for you. But maybe it's an opportunity, you know? You've always been good with your hands. You could renovate that barn, turn it into something cool. Maybe a rural Airbnb or something. The irony was so thick I could almost feel it through the phone. Josh, I said, did you have time to review the company documents? The contracts, the financial statements. Oh man, that's Monday's job. Today is a day to celebrate. Besides, I have my dad's accountant Rita, to take care of those boring things. My job is to network and close new deals. Sure. Makes sense. Exactly. To each his own talents, right? I take care of the important business, you take care of the barn. Another laugh. Speaking of which, I have to hang up. The blonde at table 3 is giving me the eye. You know how it is. He hung up without saying goodbye. I went back to the video. Dad was explaining exactly how Josh would react in the first few months. The initial euphoria, the extravagant spending, the refusal to look at important documents. How he would try to hire expensive consultants instead of understanding the business himself. How he would blame long-time employees when the first problems arose. Josh will try to call you for help in about 6 weeks, Dad predicted with disturbing accuracy. First it will be something small, difficulty accessing a system, confusion about a specific contract. Then the calls will get more desperate. In 3 months, he'll be asking about loans. The final part of the video contains specific instructions on how to access Campbell Holdings assets, including passwords, account numbers, and contacts for specialized lawyers Dad had secretly hired. The barn isn't just your inheritance, Dan. It's your new corporate headquarters. On the second floor, behind the west wall, there's a complete office I had built last year. Computers, printers, everything you need to run a real business. He leaned closer to the camera. Your brother has spent his entire life believing that deserving something is the same as being prepared for it. You've spent your entire life preparing for things you never thought you deserved. It's time to find out which approach produces better results. The video ended with Dad smiling, not the tired smile I remembered from recent years, but that confident smile from my childhood, when he still believed he could teach anyone anything. On the black screen that followed, a text message appeared, secondary file unlocked. Check legal documents folder on desktop. I clicked on the folder. Hundreds of documents organized by category, client contracts, financial records, intellectual property, legal correspondence. 5 years of meticulous preparation for this exact moment. My phone rang again. Unknown number. Hello. Dan Campbell? This is Rita Gonzalez, accountant at Campbell Printing. We need to talk urgently. Preferably in person. Rita had worked with Dad for 15 years. Always calm, she never called after 6 in the evening. If she was calling me at 10:30 at night, something was very wrong. Sure, Rita. Has something happened? Josh asked me to review some contracts this afternoon. Dan. Her voice trembled slightly. I don't think your father has told you everything about the company's financial situation. Can we meet tomorrow? I have information you need to know. How about 8 in the morning? At the Starbucks on Merrimon Avenue. Perfect. And Dan? Don't mention our conversation to Josh yet. Please. After she hung up, I went back to the folder of documents. Every file I opened confirmed what Dad had explained in the video. Josh hadn't inherited an empire. He had inherited a financial time bomb with a fuse of approximately 90 days. And me? Well, I had inherited the tools to defuse it or let it explode. The choice was entirely mine. I stayed up until 3 in the morning reading contracts and financial statements. Not out of masochism or a thirst for revenge, but because I finally understood what Dad had been trying to teach me all these years when he forced me to review every detail before starting any project. Measure twice, cut once, he always said. Haste makes waste. Josh had spent his entire life cutting first and measuring later. And now, for the first time, the consequences would be too real to ignore. While he was probably celebrating with expensive champagne and impressed strangers, I was discovering that Dad had given me something much more valuable than a thriving company. He had given me the opportunity to build a thriving company the right way. But first, I had to decide if Josh deserved to be saved from himself. My meeting with Rita the next morning confirmed my worst fears about Josh, and my best hopes about Dad. She arrived at Starbucks with 3 bulky folders and deep dark circles under her eyes, clearly having spent the night reviewing documents. Rita had always been meticulous, the kind of person who checks her calculations 3 times before submitting any report. Dan, your father made me swear I would never reveal this while he was alive, she began, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the first folder. But now, I need you to understand what Josh has really inherited. Over the next hour and a half, Rita showed me the true financial state of Campbell Printing Solutions. The debts Dad had strategically accumulated. The contracts that looked lucrative but had devastating penalty clauses. The variable rate loans that would skyrocket in 6 months. Your father had been building this for 2 years, Rita explained, pointing to a complex spreadsheet. Every financial decision was calculated to create a temporary illusion of prosperity. Josh has approximately 90 days before reality becomes impossible to ignore. And you knew this all along? I knew there were irregularities, but your father told me it was part of a bigger plan. He never fully explained it until he gave me this letter 3 weeks before he died. She handed me a sealed envelope. Specific instructions to give it to you when Josh started asking questions about the numbers. Dad's letter to Rita was straightforward. Helping Josh would prolong his agony and rob him of the opportunity to learn humility. Letting him face the consequences alone would be painful but educational. He'll blame me when he finds out I knew, Rita said, putting the documents away. Probably. But Dad left an emergency fund to cover your salary for the next 6 months, regardless of what happens to the company. You won't be financially harmed. The relief on her face was evident. Your father really thought of everything, didn't he? Yes. He did. I returned home with crystal clear clarity about my situation. Dad had given me a choice, but he had also provided me with all the tools I needed to make an informed decision. I could save Josh from imminent bankruptcy using Campbell Holdings resources, or I could let him learn the lessons he never wanted to hear. The decision should have been difficult. Family is family, right? But then Josh called. Little bro. His voice was even more excited than the day before. You won't believe what happened. I just closed my second big deal in 2 days. $250,000 with a hospital chain in Charlotte. Congratulations, I replied, flipping through the documents Rita had given me. The hospital contract was listed there, one of the traps Dad had set. Impossible margins, unrealistic timelines, late penalties that could bankrupt the company. Yeah man, I really have the Midas touch. Everything I touch turns to gold. He laughed loudly. You know what I did last night? I bought that Porsche I've always wanted. Paid cash. $58,000, baby. $58,000 the company couldn't afford to lose. Money that should have been set aside for operating costs for the coming months. Did you finance it through the company? Of course. Perks of being CEO, right? Dad did it all the time. Another lie. Dad never mixed personal expenses with company expenses. By the way, I'm thinking of throwing a party to celebrate my new position. Something big, you know? At the country club, premium champagne, maybe 100 guests. Josh, have you looked at the contracts you inherited? The financial details. Oh man, why? Everything is working perfectly. The numbers the accountant presented are fantastic. The company is making more money than ever. His willful ignorance was impressive. Besides, I have that meeting with investors next week. They're interested in expanding operations to other states. Another trap Dad had set. The investors were actually loan sharks in disguise who would offer loans with impossible terms. If you're following this story of family inheritances and discovering how appearances can be deceiving, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories that will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about family and justice. Josh, I think you should review these contracts yourself. Don't just trust what other people tell you. Dan, he laughed condescendingly. I know you're worried, but that's the difference between us. You've always been too cautious, always needing to understand every detail before acting. I see the big picture. I see opportunities where you see problems. What if there are real problems with these contracts? Then I'll fix them on the spot. Dad always said that leadership is about making quick decisions and trusting your instincts. Another distortion of the truth. Dad had said exactly the opposite. Leadership was about meticulous preparation and humility to admit when you didn't know something. The conversation ended with Josh inviting me to his housewarming party at the country club on Friday. It's going to be epic, bro. You can even bring someone, if you can find a date by then. Another casual taunt, another demonstration that Josh saw our relationship as a competition that he always won. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon in the barn, exploring the secret office Dad had built on the second floor. It was impressive. 3 state-of-the-art computers, commercial printers, a video conferencing system, and files organized with a military precision that always characterized Dad's work. There was also a folder labeled Josh Contingency Plan, with detailed instructions on how to take control of Campbell Printing Solutions if it declared bankruptcy. Dad had negotiated preliminary agreements with key creditors, identified which valuable employees should be retained, and even drawn up a restructuring schedule. He had really thought of everything. The folder also contained psychological profiles of Josh written over several years. Dad documented every display of arrogance, every refusal to accept feedback, every occasion when Josh blamed others for his own mistakes. It was like reading a scientific study of narcissism applied to business. The last entry, dated 2 weeks before Dad's death, simply read, "Josh will never change willingly. The only hope is that the consequences will be so severe that he has no choice but to learn. Dan will have to decide if he wants to be part of the lesson or part of the rescue." That night, I made my decision. I would not save Josh. Not because I wanted to see him suffer, but because Dad was right. Rescuing him would rob him of the only real opportunity for growth he had ever had. And besides, saving Josh would mean validating all the years of humiliation, all the taunts, all the toxic dynamics he had cultivated between us. Instead, I would do something different. I would prepare to take control of the wreckage when Josh finally realized he was sinking. I would use the resources Dad left me to rebuild the company the right way, hiring the employees Josh would inevitably fire, honoring the contracts he would abandon. It wouldn't be revenge. It would be constructive justice. I spent the next few days preparing meticulously. I studied every contract, every financial aspect, every business relationship of the company. I discreetly contacted key employees, letting them know that resources were available if they needed stability during the upcoming transition. Josh, meanwhile, continued his public celebration. He posted photos of his new Porsche on Instagram, hosted expensive lunches to impress potential clients, and had already made 3 unnecessary hires of executive consultants with exorbitant salaries. His every move accelerated the timeline Dad had set. Instead of 90 days to collapse, Josh was shortening it to 60 days. On Thursday night, the eve of his big party, Josh called me one last time. "Bro, you're coming tomorrow, right? It's going to be the night of my life. Everyone important in Asheville will be there. The mayor, judges, owners of the biggest companies in town." "I'll be there," I promised. "Perfect. Wear something nice, okay? I don't want you to feel out of place among so much success." He hung up laughing at his own joke. I laughed too, but for completely different reasons. The party would indeed be epic. Just not in the way Josh expected. Josh's party at the Asheville Country Club was exactly as he had promised, excessive. 300 guests circulated through the perfectly manicured gardens. Dom Perignon champagne flowed freely from uniformed waiters, and a 12-piece orchestra played soft jazz in the main pavilion. Josh had even hired fireworks for 10 o'clock that night. All paid for by Campbell Printing Solutions, of course. I arrived at 8, wearing the best suit I owned, not because Josh had asked me to, but because I wanted to look presentable for what was about to happen. Josh spotted me immediately and came running over, an expensive bourbon in his hand and that 1,000-megawatt smile he always used to impress people. "Little brother. You came." He hugged me theatrically, clearly already a few drinks beyond advisable. "Check out this party, man. Everyone who's anyone in Asheville is here. The mayor, 3 judges, the president of the Chamber of Commerce." He gestured excitedly, pointing to groups of important people scattered around the party. They all seemed to be genuinely enjoying themselves, oblivious to the fact that they were celebrating with money that technically didn't exist. "Impressive," I replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. "And you won't believe what happened today. I closed 2 more deals. $500,000 in new business this week alone." Josh practically shouted with excitement. Dad would be proud, right? I've multiplied his success in a matter of weeks. Before I could respond, we were interrupted by Rita, the accountant, who approached us with a tense expression that contrasted sharply with the party around us. "Josh," she said, her voice low but urgent, "I need to talk to you. It's about the numbers you asked me to review yesterday." "Rita. My favorite accountant." Josh wrapped her in an awkward hug. "Relax, woman. It's a party. The numbers can wait until Monday." "Actually they can't," she insisted, refusing the glass of champagne Josh tried to force into her hands. "Josh, there are some serious discrepancies I've discovered. Mainly in the contracts you signed this week." Josh's smile faltered for the first time since I arrived. "What kind of discrepancies?" Rita looked around nervously, clearly uncomfortable having this conversation in the middle of a party. "The contracts with the hospital chain and the Nashville group. The margins are impossible. Even operating with perfect efficiency, the company would lose money on both. Impossible, Josh laughed, but there was a forced note in his voice. Dad always had tight margins. That's normal in the printing business. Josh, these aren't tight margins. These are contracts with guaranteed losses. And the deadlines, we don't have the equipment or the staff to meet those schedules. The bourbon in Josh's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. For the first time since I'd known him, I saw real uncertainty in his eyes. You must be misreading it. Dad never signed bad contracts. Actually, I interrupted gently, Dad signed exactly those contracts. 2 years ago. Josh turned to me, confusion replacing confidence. What are you talking about? The contracts you signed this week aren't new, Josh. They're renewals of agreements Dad made when he wasn't thinking with complete clarity. Rita looked at me in surprise. This was the first time I had ever demonstrated knowledge of the company's business. That doesn't make sense, Josh stammered. I read the contracts. They're profitable. The numbers in the header are profitable, I agreed. But did you read the penalty clauses? The technical specifications? The quality requirements that will require redoing at least 30% of each job. The champagne glass slipped from my hand, not accidentally, and shattered on the marble floor. The noise cut our conversation short, but it also provided the perfect excuse to slip away from the festive crowd. Let's talk in private, I suggested, pointing to a more secluded area of the club. Josh followed me mechanically, his mind clearly trying to process what he had just heard. Rita came with us, carrying a briefcase that I suspected contained all the evidence she had uncovered. We sat down at an isolated table on the back terrace, away from the music and laughter. The view from there showed the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance, serene under the starry sky, a stark contrast to the storm that was about to explode in Josh's life. Explain this properly, Josh demanded, his voice having lost all its previous cheerfulness. How do you know about these contracts? Because Dad told me. In the last few months before he died, he explained exactly what he was doing with the company. Bullshit. Dad never discussed business with you. You're right. He never discussed it. He showed me. I took my phone out of my pocket and opened the folder where I had saved screenshots of some of the most relevant documents. Want to see the actual timeline of the Nashville contract? Or would you rather I explain why you're going to have to return 80% of the advance payment when you fail to meet the deadline? Josh snatched the phone from my hand, his eyes quickly scanning the images on the screen. With every second, his expression grew paler. This can't be right. Where did you get these documents? From the same place I got this. I showed him a second folder on my phone, containing photographs of correspondence between Dad and the company's creditors. And this. A third folder with emails between Dad and bankruptcy lawyers. The ensuing silence was broken only by the distant sound of the party continuing, as if nothing had changed. Rita, Josh finally said, his voice almost a whisper, what is the real financial state of the company? No beating around the bush. How long do we have? With this week's expenses and the commitments you've made? Approximately 6 weeks before we can no longer pay suppliers. Josh buried his face in his hands. When he looked up again, there was something different in his eyes, no longer blind arrogance, but a kind of controlled panic I had never seen before. Why would Dad do that? Why would he give me a company that's going bankrupt? To see what you would do with it, I replied simply. To find out if you were capable of recognizing problems, asking for help, or if you would continue pretending you knew everything. And you knew. All this time, you knew I was burying myself. I knew. And you didn't say anything. Would you have listened? Josh was silent for a long moment, processing the question. We both knew the answer. So what happens now? He finally asked. Does the company go bankrupt? Do I lose everything? That depends, I said, pulling a business card from my pocket. Campbell Holdings LLC is interested in acquiring the viable assets of Campbell Printing Solutions. For a fair price, considering the liabilities involved. Josh took the card and read the name printed on it, Daniel Campbell, CEO. Understanding washed over his face like a wave. Campbell Holdings, it's yours. It's mine. And you're going to buy the company for a fraction of what it should be worth. I'm going to buy a company that's worth exactly what it's worth. No more, no less. Josh rose from the table so abruptly that he knocked over his chair. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me. Instead, he just stood there, staring at the business card as if it were a death sentence. You planned this, he said, his voice laden with a mixture of anger and something like admiration. From the beginning, you planned to let me hang myself. No, Josh. I planned to give you the chance to learn something Dad never managed to teach you. Humility. The party music stopped abruptly. Through the terrace windows, we could see the waiters beginning to set up the table for the fireworks. In 20 minutes, 300 people would be watching a pyrotechnic celebration funded by a company that was 6 weeks away from bankruptcy. Josh looked toward the party, then at me, then at the card in his hands. What if I don't accept your offer? Then Campbell Holdings will buy the assets directly from the creditors in 3 months, when bankruptcy is declared, for a much lower price. What about the employees? The people who have worked there for decades? They will be retained. In fact, they will be retained regardless of your decision. But if you agree to work with me on the transition, I can guarantee that you will also have a place in the new structure. Josh looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. You'd offer me a job? After all this? I'd offer you the chance to learn the business the right way. Starting at the bottom, understanding every process, every customer, every real challenge. I paused. Exactly as Dad wanted you to do 15 years ago. The fireworks began at that moment, lighting up the sky with golden and red explosions. The party erupted in a collective cheer, people applauding and pointing at the luminous spectacle. Josh watched the fireworks for a moment, then held out his hand to me. Dad really knew what he was doing, didn't he? I squeezed his hand firmly. He always knew, Josh. The question was whether we did. 2 years later, Josh arrived at the barn at 7 in the morning, as he did every day. He no longer drove a Porsche. His used Toyota had 200,000 miles on it and ran perfectly. The Nashville contracts are ready for review, he said, placing a neatly organized folder on my desk. The transformation had been gradual but complete. Josh had learned every process in the company from the ground up: machine operation, quality control, customer relations. No shortcuts, no privileges, just honest work. How's team morale? I asked. Hi. Rita said this was our best quarter in 5 years. He smiled, not the arrogant smile of before, but something genuine. And Dan? Thank you for giving me this chance. Campbell Holdings had grown 300%. We kept all the old employees, hired 15 new ones, and Josh had become my best operations manager. The house in the barn? I turned it into an office upstairs and my residence downstairs. Simple, functional, honest. Josh lived in a modest apartment and drove that Toyota with pride. He had learned the difference between having money and being worth money. Last week, we visited Dad's grave together. He knew I needed to fall, Josh said, pulling weeds from the headstone. He knew you had the strength to pick me up. Dad always knew who we were, I replied. We just had to figure it out for ourselves. The barn Josh called a consolation prize became the headquarters of a company that employs 60 people. The $4 million company he inherited? Well, it taught him the most valuable lesson of his life. Sometimes the greatest inheritances come disguised as disappointments. And sometimes losing everything is the only way to find who you really are. If this story of family, humility, and second chances touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that show how life's greatest lessons come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Because in the end, Dad gave us exactly what we needed: Josh, humility, me, confidence. And both of us, a second chance to be real brothers.